Alright, so every now and then, I get into these kind of, honestly, they're best described as kind of bitch fests about my issue with George Lucas. Overall, let me just say right off the bat, Disney has only semi-partially redeemed themselves in my eyes. With the Marvel Universe, they've done really well at taking an existing storyline and making it into movie and TV and going multimedia with it. They've done well, in my opinion, with the Marvel series. Could they do more? Sure. But are they doing it wrong? No, they're not harming the story in any way. Star Wars, on the other hand, and I don't entirely blame them for it, Lucas kind of fucked his own thing up. 4, 5, and 6 are a decent trilogy. And leaving those as the established central basis for the Star Wars stories, Lucas allowed other people to offer up their ideas for storyline. Lucasfilms had what is called a continuity editor, which is somebody that when you, as a hired author, presented a story to be added to the Star Wars universe, they went over it, checked it, and made sure that it fit in with Lucas's own established storyline for the Star Wars universe. Now, the problem here is that when Lucas made the prequels, a lot of people immediately got irritated from like the first movie, because the first thing he started doing was altering the established timeline that he himself had helped establish. Changing little details like, where Boba Fett came from, that's fine. I mean, you can go with canon, non-canon, this, that, and the other. And in the end, it's only stuff that Lucas, puts his film stamp on that has real credibility. I get you. But to a lot of us, the books in the series are just as much canon. That's the legends. That's when you see people going, oh, that's from this or this. They're usually talking about one of the Star Wars novels. A brief moment. And before I get too caught up in the bashing, let me just say that I think a huge part of Lucas's problem is, well, frankly, what a lot of other directors, his peers, had to say, which is that basically Lucas seems to have gotten caught up in the production. That's why he started going back and doing that thing fucking artists do, where they won't stop tampering with their own creation. Like, you bet your ass if somebody hadn't at some point basically told Michelangelo to put the goddamn brush down, or the chisel, or whatever tool he happened to be fucking using at the time, that he'd have kept on fucking with a piece until it was almost wrong. Lucas's ego started to get in the way of his work. He started trying to tinker with shit and fuck with things and play with this and play with that. One of the biggest things that bothered people was before he even made the prequels, he started doing with something which I jokingly refer to as pulling a Trent Reznor. Now, when somebody pulls a Lucas, it's basically they start in the middle of the storyline and tell you the end, and then go back and start telling you the beginning, and then finish off by telling you everything that happened afterwards. It's a very, very confusing way of telling a story. He told us the middle first, and then jumped back to the beginning, and then told us the end of the story, and it's... Lost my train of thought there for a moment. I know I had a reference to Trent Reznor. That's what it was. It was what Reznor started doing was he released 9 Inch Nails' Pretty Hate Machine. And there's a bunch of singles off of that you got various production and mixing and editing and stuff done to it. And that's okay, because the industrial scene that he was just opening up, that he was just bringing to the mainstream, rather, because it's not like it's his invention. Sorry, traffic distractions. Anyway, he started doing mixing and editing and playing with his pieces, and essentially there's let me go on before I get distracted. He released this album, and it's a good album, and a lot of people did mixing and editing to some of the songs off of it. And his second album, professional album, Broken, he did a lot of editing and mixing too after it was released. You can go look up that album. It's called Fixed, and it's not really that much of an improvement over Broken. It's not bad. I mean, when you get down to it, it's still a good Trent Reznor album, but Fixed is mostly just a cleaned up alternate production of Broken. He really went off the rails with the album The Downward Spiral. I guess appropriately named in that regard, because he started releasing edits of that one almost immediately. One of which is called Further Down the Spiral. And there's one extended disc that you can pick up that is basically like 7 different variations on one of the tracks called March of the Pigs. And he just got really too much into the production. And that's, I think, what happened with Lucas. You know, he started doing shit at first, like he got a better setup so he could do things like clean up the edges around, like in some of the space battles, you can still see little boxes around the TIE fighters and the X-Wings. He went through and he digitally altered those so that they're not as obvious, so that there's, so it looks more realistic, I guess, would be a better way to put it. And then he started getting, past that. And once you've gone through and you've cleaned up a bunch of stuff, well, what he did was he started adding shit. Like actual shit. Like, a Ronto, which is a really long-necked, stumpy-legged creature that you see standing in the background swinging a Jawa around at one point, and it takes a crap, and one of the other background ancillary characters steps in it. And none of this is important. None of it needs to exist in the movie. None of it needed to be added after the fact. It adds nothing to the storyline. It's just minutia and distraction in the background. And you can see right there immediately what's starting to happen is Lucas is starting to get caught up in the spectacle, in the production, in the ego, in the trying too hard to tell the story that he thinks he wants to tell. And I think that might have a lot to do with why the prequels are basically 3 movies long of Anakin Skywalker's backstory, which, I'm sorry, none of us needed another movie about an angsty teenager who grows up to be ridiculously powerful and causes damage to everything around him. So he starts adding shit, tinkering with shit, starts going off of the established storyline that he had already agreed to. Like, he suddenly decided that Boba Fett, was not who the storyline said he was. Now he's a clone. Raised by the bounty hunter template that they used to make the clone army. No, come on, man. I mean, some of this stuff was there. But some things like the Clone Wars, man, the Clone Wars were a barely discussed thing in the original storyline. Nobody really mentioned it. Except a brief thing in pilot during the Clone Wars. In the first Star Wars movie, Episode 4. And I get it, it's his story. He can tell it any way he wants. But when you invite people in, you got to accept that the things that they put in that you say are okay to put in, you can't just come back later and, and shit on that part of the storyline. You agreed to it. You allowed it to be there. It was a mutual decision. They didn't come in and force you to stick that in there. When Disney bought it, they didn't have any requirement to stick with the established storyline. They could have gone any direction they wanted. I'm not upset with Disney in that regard because they got Lawrence Kasdan to come back and do part of the storyline. Hey, dipshit, what's going on there? Just run the stop sign. Disney could have gone so many different bad directions with the Star Wars series. I'm waiting for the last one to see where they're going with it, but the story so far has been... Come on, man. Are you guys really going to try and say that Episode 7 was not just let's build a bigger Death Star? I mean, they even had a conversation about that in the movie. Like Poe Dameron or somebody says something about a Death Star. Han Solo might have been the one to say it. And they immediately have this discussion about, no, this was the Death Star. This thing is bigger. Oh, so it's a bigger Death Star. I gotcha. Capable of destroying entire solar systems at once. Nice. Isn't that what the first Star Destroyer did? But Disney has not impressed me with Star Wars. They haven't really impressed me over the years with their movies because they market a lot of their films towards children and they're not really kids films. I mean, let's take a quick look at some of the shit from like the late 70s, early 80s, the entire 80s, the early 90s. Man, do you remember Escape from Witch Mountain? That's was that a government agency trying to murder children? None of the stories that they market towards children are really kid-friendly. There's a lot of death and violence in them. We're okay with that being what we show to kids. Cartoonish violence, so they're okay with it later, so that they can watch the realistic grown-up violence, I suppose. I bitch about this topic all the time. But I'll bitch more about it later. Regardless, time to go back into work. Doot.